The old ones of the Kelthari Dominion had a saying, passed down through 11,000 years of conquest, and it went like this. A species that has never tasted true annihilation cannot understand the mercy of surrender. They believed it the way they believed the sun would rise on their home world. They believed it the way they believed in their own fleets, their own doctrine, their own manifest right to expand into whatever quiet, unclaimed corner of the galaxy they wished. And on the day this story begins, in a war room built into the belly of a command carrier, called the Voice of Judgment, that belief was about to die, along with almost everything else they thought they understood. The council chamber was silent when Fleet Marshal Doskin Varelith entered. It was the kind of silence that had weight to it, the kind that pressed against the eardrums, because 40 hours earlier, the Third Expansion Fleet had engaged what their scouts identified as the primary defense force of a species designated Terran, and the engagement had ended in what every preliminary report called a resounding victory. Varelith had come to hear the numbers. He had come to be told how many human ships remained so that he could calculate how many more days it would take to erase the species from its homeworld entirely. He did not expect the silence to last as long as it did. And he did not expect the officer standing at the far end of the chamber, a mid-ranking intelligence analyst named Yethel Karim, to have her hands folded so tightly behind her back that her knuckles had lost their color. He did not expect, when he finally spoke, for his own voice to sound so certain, because certainty was about to become the most expensive thing in the room. "Report," Varelith said. "How many ships do they have left?" Old Karim did not answer immediately, and that, more than anything else, should have told him something was wrong. The story of how the Kelthari Dominion arrived at that terrible silence began, as these stories often do, with contempt. It began 9 months earlier, when a Dominion survey cluster drifted into a system on the outer rim that human charts called Sol, and Kelthari charts did not call anything at all, because the Dominion had never bothered to catalog a system so unremarkable. A single yellow star, a handful of rocky worlds, one blue planet with an atmosphere thick with the biochemical noise of life, and orbiting that planet, a scattering of vessels that any Dominion tactician would have described, without a flicker of doubt, as primitive. The humans hailed the survey cluster. They asked, politely, who their visitors were and what their intentions might be. The Dominion commander of that cluster, a mid-tier officer named Bren Ashel Korvath, answered with an ultimatum. He informed the government of a species he had known existed for exactly 11 minutes, that their world was now protectorate of the Kelthari Dominion, that resistance was mathematically impossible, and that failure to submit within one planetary rotation would result in what his own logs euphemistically called corrective action. He gave humanity 24 hours to kneel to a civilization it had never heard of. Humanity's answer was silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of a species calculating its own extinction and finding no way out of the math. It was the silence of a species that had heard threats before, from each other, across 100,000 years of its own bloody, magnificent, catastrophic history, and had learned, at terrible cost, exactly what silence could mean when it was chosen rather than imposed. Korvath mistook it for submission. He logged it as such. He began drafting his commendation request before the 24 hours had even elapsed, congratulating himself on a bloodless conquest, and when the deadline passed and no formal surrender arrived, he grew impatient rather than suspicious. He ordered a probing strike against what his scans identified as a modest orbital defense platform above the human world's largest landmass, intending to demonstrate Dominion resolve and accelerate the surrender he was certain was already being drafted somewhere in the human capitals below. The probing strike did not return. Not one ship, not one drone, not one telemetry burst. Korvath's superiors, when informed, did not panic. Panic was not in their vocabulary, not yet, because panic requires the belief that something has gone catastrophically wrong, and the Dominion command structure did not yet believe humanity capable of catastrophe. They believed in accidents, equipment failure. A stray asteroid field the survey had missed. They dispatched the Third Expansion Fleet, 42 capital ships strong, with orders to secure the system, locate the missing probing strike, and complete what Korvath had started. This was the fleet that engaged humanity's defenses 40 hours before Ol-Karim stood in the council chamber, unable to give her Fleet Marshal an answer. This was the fleet whose survivors, all 6 of them, limped back through the debris field of what had once been 36 capital ships, carrying sensor logs that nobody in the Dominion High Command wanted to believe. And this was the reason the council had convened. Ellis took his seat at the head of the long obsidian table, and around him settled the rest of the War Council. 12 officers whose careers had been built on 11,000 years of institutional certainty, of campaigns against species that broke, species that fled, species that begged. They looked at Ol-Karim the way predators look at prey that has, for some reason, stopped running. The preliminary reports from the engagement suggested a Dominion victory, Ellis said, and his tone made clear that this was not a question so much as an instruction for her to confirm it. 36 of our ships were lost, yes. Acceptable losses, given the size of the target's defense grid. What matters now is accounting. How many ships do they have left? Give me the number, so we can plan the next phase of the campaign. With respect, Fleet Marshal, Ol-Karim said, I would like to walk the Council through the intelligence in sequence. The number on its own will be meaningless without context. Ellis' jaw tightened. You have 5 minutes of context. Then I want the number, she began. She began, as any good intelligence officer would, with the easy part, the part that was merely troubling rather than incomprehensible. She displayed a tactical reconstruction of the battle above the human capital. 36 Dominion capital ships, arranged in the standard suppression formation, a formation that had broken the will of 43 species across 11 millennia of Dominion expansion. Opposing them, according to the fleet's own sensor logs, at the moment of engagement, had been 11 human vessels. 11. Several officers around the table actually laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from relief, from the restoration of an expected order, because 11 ships against 36 was exactly the sort of ratio the Dominion was built to annihilate. 11 ships destroyed 36 of ours, Ellis said slowly, testing the words, finding them absurd even as he spoke them. That is not a victory ratio. Analyst Ol-Karim, that is a catastrophe. Explain it. The 11 ships were not what destroyed the fleet. Fleet Marshal. The laughter stopped. They were what we detected, she continued. Our sensor suite was calibrated for the emission signatures we cataloged from the human orbital defense platform during the initial probing strike. Standard Dominion doctrine assumes that a species at humanity's technological tier, as measured by their communications infrastructure and industrial output, could not field vessels of significant size without generating detectable heat and drive signatures consistent with our own engineering. 11 ships were all that matched that signature. She paused. They were the ones the humans wanted us to see. The chamber went very still. Human engineering philosophy, as we are now coming to understand it, differs from ours in a foundational way, Ol-Karim said. The Dominion builds for efficiency. We build the smallest vessel capable of delivering the necessary force, because resource conservation across an 11,000-year expansion has been doctrine since before any of us were born. Humanity, it appears, builds for endurance under conditions of near total resource denial. Their vessels are layered, armored beneath armor, powered by redundant systems that our sensors read as background radiation rather than active drive cores, because their engineers appear to have spent considerable effort making their power signatures indistinguishable from stellar noise. You are telling me, Ellis said, that there were more than 11 ships in that engagement. I am telling you that after the battle, our own hull-mounted forensic sensors, the short-range systems designed to catalog wreckage for salvage purposes, recorded emission ghosts consistent with no fewer than 60 additional vessels operating within the engagement envelope. Vessels that were never flagged by our primary tactical sensors. Vessels that, as far as our detection suite was concerned, simply did not exist. 60. That is the minimum bound, Fleet Marshal. The actual number could not be verified before the surviving ships were forced to withdraw. Around the table, the officers who had been laughing moments before now sat with their hands very still on the obsidian surface, and Ellis allowed himself a long breath through his nasal slits, the Kelthari equivalent of a sigh, before he spoke again. 71 ships then, perhaps more, against our 36. That is a difficult ratio, analyst, but not an impossible one to explain through superior tactics or an ambush. It does not yet explain the totality of our losses. Continue. I intend to, Fleet Marshal, but I would ask the Council's patience. Because the ship count is, I promise you, the least troubling part of this report. Nobody spoke. The silence in the room had changed texture. It was no longer the confident silence of a war council, awaiting confirmation of victory. It had become something closer to the silence before a diagnosis, the silence in a medical chamber when the physician has seen the scan results and has not yet found the words to explain them to the patient. Alcrim continued, and this time she did not wait for permission. She explained that Dominion forensic teams, in the hours after the fleet's shattered remnant limped home, had begun analyzing recovered wreckage and surviving telemetry in an attempt to understand precisely how 36 capital ships, vessels that had subdued armed insurrections on a dozen worlds, had been reduced to debris in less than 22 minutes. What they found did not fit any framework the Dominion possessed. The human weapons were not more powerful than Dominion weapons, not in the raw sense the Council understood power. A single human energy lance, when its output was measured against a Dominion equivalent, was almost embarrassingly modest. But where Dominion doctrine treated weapons as tools of overwhelming force delivered at range, in the expectation that enemies would break and flee before matters became personal, human doctrine, as best as the forensic teams could reconstruct it, treated every engagement as though it were already the last battle they would ever fight. Human ships did not withdraw when damaged. Dominion combat logs across 11,000 years showed a consistent pattern that enemy vessels sustaining catastrophic hull damage would attempt retreat, would broadcast distress, would seek to preserve crew and vessel for a later engagement. It was rational. It was in Dominion military philosophy, simply correct, because a fleet preserved was a fleet that could fight another day. Not one human vessel in the engagement had retreated. Forensic analysis of a single wrecked human corvette, recovered nearly intact from the debris field, showed that its crew had continued operating weapon systems for nearly 4 minutes after the vessel's reactor had been breached, after internal atmosphere had vented entirely. Chuff, after every survival algorithm the Dominion possessed, would have called the ship and crew already dead. They had kept fighting inside a hull filling with vacuum, using emergency suits with an estimated 11 minutes of life support because the 4 minutes they spent continuing to fire had allowed them to destroy a Dominion escort that would otherwise have been free to reinforce elsewhere in the formation. They did the arithmetic, Alcrim said quietly. They knew they were already dead, and they spent the only currency they had left, which was time, to make sure their deaths mattered to the battle. That is not the behavior of a species that panics under fire. Fleet Marshal, that is the behavior of a species that has made peace with the idea of dying, so long as the dying accomplishes something. Verelith's claws, unconsciously, had begun to score faint lines into the obsidian table. A single crew's desperation is not doctrine, he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. It was not a single crew, Fleet Marshal. It was the entire fleet. Every recovered wreck shows the same pattern. Every intercepted communication in the final minutes of the engagement shows the same pattern. There is a recording, retrieved from a partially destroyed relay buoy, of a human commander's final transmission before her vessel was lost. I have had it translated. I believe the Council should hear it. She did not wait for permission this time. Either. The recording played. It was rough, fragmented by damage, the voice beneath it calm, in a way that unsettled every non-human ear in the chamber, because calm, in the Dominion's long experience of conquest, was not a sound a dying species made. This is Captain Ades Brennan of the Terran vessel Resolute to any Allied unit receiving. Hull integrity failing, reactor critical. We are continuing to engage. If you are hearing this and you still have weapons, use them. Make them pay for every meter. We are not the last line. We were never the last line. Fight. The recording ended. The chamber did not move for nearly a full minute. We are not the last line, Verelith repeated very quietly, and something in the way he said it suggested he already understood, on some animal level beneath his conscious thought, exactly what those words meant, even before Al-Karim confirmed it. That statement, she said, was the first indication we had that the 11 ships detected and the 60 additional ships forensically confirmed might not represent the totality of humanity's military capacity. Captain Brennan did not describe her fleet as the last line of defense. She described it as a line, one of several by clear implication. I began, at that point, to review every scrap of intelligence the Dominion had gathered on humanity since first contact, cross-referenced against this new understanding of their doctrine and their engineering philosophy. What I found troubled me enough that I brought it directly to the Council, rather than filing a standard report. "Show us," Fretlith said. What followed was the part of the briefing that, decades later, Dominion historians would describe as the moment the 11,000-year certainty of the Kelthori war doctrine began, quietly and irreversibly, to die. Al-Karim explained that humanity's own historical record, gathered from intercepted communications, cultural broadcasts, and archived data that predated first contact, painted the portrait of a species that had spent the entirety of its recorded existence at war, not with alien powers, but with itself. Two great convulsions of industrialized violence within a single century of their own calendar had taught them to build war machines at a scale and a pace that dwarfed anything the peaceful, centrally coordinated Dominion had ever required. Where the Dominion expanded slowly, methodically, subjugating one world at a time across centuries with fleets built at a leisurely, sustainable pace, humanity had within living memory of its oldest citizens converted the entire industrial output of a single nation-state into war production within a matter of months, and had done so more than once, on more than one side of more than one conflict. They had also, she noted, spent the better part of a century after their worst conflict building weapons designed exclusively to end their own species entirely, not out of aggression, but out of a doctrine of mutual deterrence so thoroughly internalized that it had become, by the time of first contact, simply background architecture, the unremarked furniture of their civilization. A species that had built and maintained, and quietly modernized for generations, enough destructive capacity to erase itself several times over, purely on the logic that the alternative might be worse. They live, Al-Karim said, with the mathematics of annihilation as a permanent feature of their culture. It is not new to them. It is not shocking to them. When Commander Korvath issued his ultimatum, he believed he was introducing the concept of existential threat to a species that had never considered it. In fact, Fleet Marshal, he was speaking to, perhaps, the only species in this quadrant of the galaxy that had already spent a century rehearsing precisely that conversation with itself in the mirror. "You are saying they were prepared for this?" "I am saying, Fleet Marshal, that we did not introduce humanity to the concept of extinction. We reminded them of an old and familiar fear, one they had already spent 100 years designing an answer to. The Council Chamber's environmental systems, Kelthori standard and finely tuned to detect and moderate the pheromonal stress markers of command staff under duress, had begun, subtly, to increase airflow. Several of the assembled officers were sweating in ways their species rarely did outside combat. "There is more," Al-Karim said. She detailed what her deeper analysis had uncovered once she knew what to search for. Humanity's public communications. The broadcasts and cultural archives the Dominion had dismissed as unimportant background noise during the initial survey were riddled, once properly parsed, with a recurring theme that Dominion linguistic analysis had failed to flag as strategically relevant, because it did not fit any existing Dominion category for military intelligence. It was the theme of the underdog, the overlooked, the quiet power held in reserve. Across every human culture, in every era of their recorded history, the stories they told one another and preserved and repeated across generations were not stories of overwhelming force crushing the weak. They were stories of the weak, the small, the dismissed, discovering the strength within themselves at the exact moment their enemies believed the matter already settled. "It is not merely a story they enjoy, Fleet Marshal," Al-Karim said. "It is the story they consider to be true about themselves, told so many times in so many forms across so many centuries that I believe it has become something closer to a species-wide expectation than a mere narrative preference. They do not simply hope to be underestimated and then surprise their enemies. I believe, based on the totality of the cultural record, that they consider being underestimated a tactical asset to be cultivated, and being ready when the underestimation is finally punished a cultural inevitability. Korvath's ultimatum, Varelith said slowly, did not frighten them into planning a defense in 24 hours. No, Fleet Marshal. I do not believe it did. I believe the defense was already there. The chamber's silence at this point in the briefing had a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on every officer at the table, because each of them, in their own way, was beginning to run the same calculation, and none of them liked where it was leading. How long, Varelith asked, would a species need to prepare a hidden reserve of the scale you are describing? That is precisely the question I attempted to answer next, Fleet Marshal. And it is the question that brings me to the reason I asked you to hear the fuller context before demanding the ship count. She displayed on the chamber's central projection column a reconstructed timeline that her team had assembled from decades of intercepted low-priority communications, industrial emissions data gathered incidentally by Dominion survey drones passing through the outer edges of the human system during routine mapping runs, decades before Korvath's cluster had ever arrived, and salvage analysis of the ship wreckage from the battle itself. The timeline was damning in a way that took several moments for the assembled officers to fully absorb. Roughly 1 century earlier by human reckoning, the species had ended its second great planetary convulsion and had, according to every scrap of their own public rhetoric, turned toward peace, toward exploration, toward the quiet business of building a unified civilization no longer defined by internal war. That, Ul-Karim explained, was the story they told the rest of the galaxy, and likely the story a great many of their own citizens genuinely believed. It was not, according to the industrial emissions data, the whole story. Buried within decades of ordinary civilian industrial output, there were signatures, faint and easily dismissed if you were not specifically looking for them, of sustained heavy construction in regions of the human system that carried no corresponding civilian population growth, no corresponding public announcement, no corresponding diplomatic footprint whatsoever. Shipyards, in other words, that did not appear on any human channel the Dominion had ever monitored, working at a pace and scale utterly disproportionate to a species that publicly presented itself as a modest, developing single-system power still finding its feet among the stars. For how long, Varelith asked, and his voice had gone very quiet, has this construction been ongoing? Best estimate, cross-referenced against 3 independent data sources, is 91 of their years, Fleet Marshal. Continuously. 91 years. Yes. Building what? Ul-Karim did not answer immediately, and in the space of that hesitation, Varelith felt something he had not felt in longer than he cared to admit, a sensation his species did not have a clean word for, something adjacent to what lesser, more primitive species across the galaxy called dread. Fleet Marshal, she said finally, I would like to return now to the question you originally asked me. How many ships do they have left? Yes, Varelith said. Tell me. To answer it honestly, I need to first explain what my team discovered when we attempted to locate the origin point of the 60 additional vessels detected in the engagement, the ones that never appeared on our primary sensors. We traced their withdrawal vectors after the battle, using the same forensic sensor data that first revealed their existence. All 60, without exception, retreated toward a specific region of the outer system, an asteroid-dense volume of space that our original survey had flagged as unremarkable and uninhabited, containing no detectable industrial activity, no detectable population, nothing worth cataloging beyond its basic mineral composition. And when we retasked a surviving reconnaissance drone to conduct a deep pass through that region, following the battle, Fleet Marshal, it did not find 60 ships. She let that sit in the air for a moment, and Varela's claws had gone entirely still against the obsidian table, the earlier scoring forgotten. It found a shipyard, Ul-Karim said, hollowed directly into the asteroid mass itself, shielded from external sensors by kilometers of solid rock, and we now believe deliberately engineered magnetic interference designed to mimic natural stellar background noise. A shipyard, Fleet Marshal, of a scale I have not personally seen matched anywhere in Dominion territory. Berths, by our count, for no fewer than 400 capital-scale vessels, and the majority of those berths were occupied. The number hung in the chamber like smoke that would not clear. 400, someone said, one of the junior officers, his voice cracking slightly on the second syllable. That is one facility identified by pure chance, because the 60 surviving vessels from the engagement happened to withdraw toward it, Karim said. Given the confirmed 91 years of continuous, deliberately concealed heavy industrial activity across multiple flagged construction zones in their system, and given that this was only one of at least 6 such zones our retrospective analysis has now identified, I would consider 400 vessels a conservative floor for a single site, not a ceiling for the whole. Varelith stood slowly and walked to the projection column himself, as though proximity to the data might somehow change its content. It did not. Tsk. You are telling this council, he said, and his voice had lost every trace of the certainty it had carried when he entered the chamber, that the fleet we engaged, the fleet we believed we defeated, the fleet whose defeat we convened this council to formalize, was not humanity's primary defense force at all. No, Fleet Marshal, I do not believe it was. Then what, in the name of every campaign this Dominion has fought in 11,000 years, was it? Karim's answer, when it came, was delivered in the flat, careful tone of an officer who understood that the words she was about to say would be repeated, studied, and dreaded across the entirety of Kelthari military history, for as long as that history continued to be written. I believe, Fleet Marshal, that what we engaged was a picket line, a screening force, the minimum commitment humanity judged necessary to blunt a single survey cluster's probing strike, and one follow-up punitive fleet without disturbing whatever it is they are actually building in those 6 concealed zones, or wherever else across their system such zones might exist that we have not yet found. That is not possible, said one of the older officers, a veteran of the pacification of the Thren cluster, a campaign fought and won 3 centuries earlier, against a species with a population in the tens of billions. No species commits a screening force of 70-plus capital ships, most of them of a size and armament we have never before catalogued, to a mere probing engagement. The economics alone would be— The economics, Karim interrupted, and it was the first time in the briefing she had spoken over a superior officer, are precisely the point, Counselor. We have been measuring humanity's capacity using Dominion economic assumptions. Dominion assumptions built on 11,000 years of steady, unhurried, centrally planned expansion where every hull represents years of careful resource allocation weighed against a dozen competing priorities. Humanity did not build like that. Humanity, 91 years ago, made a decision as a species, evidently binding across every faction and government we have observed in their public record, that they would never again allow themselves to be caught unprepared by anyone for any reason, and they began building on that assumption immediately, and did not stop. And apparently told almost no one. She turned to face the full council now, no longer directing her remarks solely to the Fleet Marshal. We asked them for their surrender within 24 hours of first contact, she said. We now know, with reasonable confidence, that this was not the first time in their history someone had demanded their unconditional surrender on short notice. We know their cultural memory treats such demands as a prelude to annihilation, not as a bureaucratic formality. And we know that for 91 years, in total secrecy, under the exact set of circumstances that would allow a species to build precisely this kind of reserve without detection from a species with precisely this kind of demonstrated industrial capacity, when sufficiently motivated, they have been doing nothing else. How many ships? Varela said again, and this time the question did not sound like a demand. It sounded, for the first time in his long and decorated career, like a plea. I cannot give you an exact figure, Fleet Marshal. I can give you the honest floor of our current knowledge, and I can tell you why I believe the true number exceeds it substantially. Give me the floor. Confirmed construction across 6 identified concealed shipyards extrapolated from the single facility we were able to directly observe suggests a minimum standing reserve in excess of 2,000 capital-scale vessels, not accounting for smaller craft, orbital defense platforms, or additional facilities we have not yet located across a system we have only partially surveyed. A sound came from somewhere down the table, one of the counselors, and it was not a word. It was simply air, forced out through a throat that had briefly forgotten how to hold it in. 2,000, Varela said, at minimum, Fleet Marshal. And I want to be clear about what that number represents. It does not represent the total warfighting capacity of the human species. It represents what we have inferred through inference layered upon inference, from wreckage, from emissions data, from a single shipyard glimpsed by a reconnaissance drone that we were fortunate enough to still have functioning after the engagement. It is the visible portion of an iceberg whose true mass we cannot yet measure, built by a species whose entire cultural and historical identity, as best as my team can determine, is built around the specific act of being underestimated and then answering that underestimation decisively. Varelith returned to his seat. He did not sit so much as allow his legs to fold beneath him, the motion of an officer whose body had simply run out of reasons to remain standing. Commander Korvath, he said quietly, to no one in particular, gave them 24 hours to kneel. Yes, Fleet Marshal. And we sent 36 ships to enforce that ultimatum, believing we were disciplining a fledgling species too small and too fragile to resist. Yes, Fleet Marshal. And in response, a species that has spent 91 years quietly building a reserve fleet in excess of 2,000 vessels, hidden from every sensor we possess, sent us 71 ships. Not their full strength. A screening force. A message delivered in the exact currency they assumed. We would understand, since diplomacy had apparently already failed the moment Korvath opened his mouth. That is my assessment, Fleet Marshal. Yes. What message? Precisely do you believe they intended to send us? Alkarim was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, her voice carried something the Dominion war doctrine had no formal category for, something between professional respect and genuine, unguarded fear. I believe the message was this: that whatever we send, they will meet it, and whatever we lose in the meeting, they will consider an acceptable cost, because losing has never once in the entirety of their recorded history been the same thing to them as losing everything. I believe, Fleet Marshal, that they intend for us to understand, through demonstration rather than negotiation, that there is no version of this conflict in which the Dominion's patience outlasts theirs, because their patience was forged across 100,000 years of surviving themselves. And ours was forged across 11,000 years of nobody ever seriously trying to make us bleed. The chamber held its silence for a long, long moment. It was Varelith who finally broke it. And when he spoke, the last trace of the officer who had walked into this room expecting a victory report was gone entirely, replaced by something colder, something that understood with total clarity the shape of the mistake that had been made in his name. So when I asked you, he said slowly, how many ships they have left, after we believed we had won a decisive engagement against their fleet. Yes, Fleet Marshal. The honest answer is not a number. Alcra met his eyes, and for the first time since she had entered the chamber, her voice did not waver at all. The honest answer, Fleet Marshal, she said, is all of them. We did not defeat their fleet. We have not yet seen their fleet. What we engaged in, what we are now assessing, was the very smallest fraction of what they were willing to spend to answer an insult, and every ship in that engagement that we destroyed was, by their own doctrine, considered an acceptable and expected cost of making certain we understood exactly what waits behind it. They have not lost a single ship that mattered to them. They have all of them left, every single one. And 91 years of quiet, patient, unbroken work still waiting behind the ones we've already seen. Nobody in the chamber spoke. Nobody in the chamber moved. Outside, the voice of judgment in the vast dark between the stars, the Dominion's third expansion fleet's 6 surviving vessels drifted in formation, waiting for orders that no one at that table yet had the courage to give, because for the first time in 11,000 years of expansion, of conquest, of demanding surrender from species too fractured or too frightened or too small to answer in kind, the Kelthari Dominion had finally sent its fleets against a people who had already buried the fear of ending, and had simply, quietly, patiently built something magnificent and terrible in its place, and waited, for as long as it took, for someone arrogant enough to make them use it. They would not have to wait much longer. And if you have made it this far, if this story pulled you in the way it pulled in that council chamber, one silence at a time, then you already know exactly why stories like this one keep finding their audience. Humanity, underestimated again, quietly magnificent again, and an enemy about to learn a lesson the galaxy will be repeating for centuries. If you want more of this, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell, because there are more stories exactly like this one coming every week. More council chambers about to go silent, more arrogant fleets about to meet the fleet they were never supposed to see. Hixpring. Drop a like if that final line hit the way it was supposed to. Tell me in the comments where you think this story goes next, what you think humanity's real fleet looks like when it finally shows itself, and which moment in this briefing was your favorite. I read everyone. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars. You never know what's quietly waiting behind them.